Making enemies and breaking rules. Why American and NATO crimes in Yugoslavia remain a real and present danger to world order. It was back in 1942 that Superman, the archetypal US hero, first launched his never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. His rousing mission statement survived unscathed right the way through the Second World War and the Cold War. But by the 1990s and Europe's Balkan conflicts, change was in the air. Superman's publishers were having doubts about the phrase, the American way. They sensed that such jingoism might be bad for business. Variety magazine noted that since 1993, the American way mantra has fallen out of favour. Why? Because Washington's growing use of force around the world, ostensibly to protect human rights and promote freedom and democracy, was making enemies, and it might lose readers. Many people were beginning to ask, why does everyone hate America? So the American way was quietly dropped. Superman's new commitment was toned down to simply achieving a better tomorrow. Unfortunately, there was no change in foreign policy, which almost guaranteed that the future could only get worse. As in all wars, the truth was the first casualty. But in Yugoslavia, unprecedented efforts were made to bury it so deeply it could never be unearthed. There was simply too much at stake. It was feared that global exposure of the crimes committed by the US and its Western allies would fatally undermine faith in the integrity and conduct of international affairs. The United States had, after all, deliberately used the UN and NATO, an exclusively defensive alliance, to illegally declare war on Yugoslavia. This was the ultimate crime, waging a war of aggression. Incredibly, the US then went on to compound this evil, creating an illegal court to justify its own criminal behavior. This political tribunal, the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia, served a dual purpose: to unfairly punish the enemy and then to impose a grossly distorted historical version of what really happened. This was no basis for a better tomorrow. So how did the Western Alliance come to lose its moral compass and commit the ultimate war crime under the cloak of humanitarianism? The traditional system of international relations dates back to the Treaty of Westphalia. This ended Europe's 30 Years' War in 1648. The settlement laid down some fundamental principles, notably those of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, each state being recognized as the supreme authority within its own borders without interference from other states. The Westphalian system also stressed the importance of diplomacy and negotiation in resolving conflicts and of promoting peaceful means of settling disputes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote that this arrangement may well remain the foundation of our political system forever. Henry Kissinger thought the same, but in fact its future is now dangerously fragile. Ever since the Second World War, the great legal edifice founded on binding international treaties has been steadily eroded to the point of collapse. Continued abuse and manipulation of international law pose an ever-growing threat to world peace. It all began with the end of the Second World War. The United Nations was essentially an American creation set up in 1945 to administer the so-called rules-based system. At the time, the purpose of the UN was clear and it made complete sense: to promote peace and prosperity and protect against the chaos of war, disaster, violence and crime. Everyone could see the urgent need for such an independent global organization with powers to intervene and resolve disputes. The trouble is, today's international order is not one in which all states are equal. According to the United Kingdom's leading defence and diplomatic think tank, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, it's a result of a series of bargains reached between the world's most powerful states following their victory in the Second World War. Most of all, it reflects the predominant post-war position of the United States in economic, political and military terms, which successive administrations then used to lead the creation of new post-war norms and institutions which suited its own interests and values. There are wide disparities in states' ability to redesign, ignore or selectively enforce them. The UN's mission, as enshrined in its charter, is to bring about, by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international laws, settlement of international disputes or situations that might lead to a breach of the peace. The underlying principles are equal rights and self-determination of peoples, promoting and encouraging human rights, and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Like any human construct, the rules-based order is not infallible. As a former Secretary-General remarked, the goal of the UN was not to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. The road to hell, however, is, as we all know, paved with good intentions, and this became increasingly apparent during the Balkan conflicts. Since there is no overarching authority to enforce compliance with the countless laws, rules and norms involved, the UN is reliant on its 193 member states working together to observe fundamental principles and agreements. These include a wide range of General Assembly and Security Council resolutions, international treaties, customs and conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and rulings by international courts and tribunals. For the UN to be effective, it's incumbent on the most powerful and influential member states to play by the rules. This is precisely where the system breaks down. Its great weakness is the de facto dominance of a United States determined to call the shots and pursue its own interests at the expense of others. As Professor Noam Chomsky has observed, the notion that the world is only safe under American leadership has always been a core principle of US foreign policy. Even before the US entered the Second World War, he wrote, high-level planners and analysts concluded in the post-war world that the United States should seek to hold unquestioned power, acting to ensure the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by any states that might act to interfere with its global design. After 1945, the US didn't attack the UN head-on. It simply began slowly to constrain and limit its power, typically by delaying its contributions to the UN budget. UN leaders soon realized there was little they could do about this, and so they decided to live with it. Deprived of its intended role as the world's policeman, the UN fell back on its fast-developing humanitarian work. Aid agencies and human rights lawyers proliferated in the wake of worldwide concern about human rights. This was fueled by graphic television coverage of conflicts brought into people's homes in real time from war zones. Loosening the rule of law made humanitarian and political intervention much simpler and less considered. During the Cold War years, 1947 to 89, the US was involved in no fewer than 64 attempted regime changes, both overt and covert. These interventions targeted all types of states, adversaries and allies, powerful and weak, democratic and authoritarian, communist and capitalist. The impulse to intervene became habitual, continuing under successive administrations in the post-Cold War era in many places. For example, Haiti in 1994, Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, and Syria 2012. Former President Jimmy Carter has declared the US the most warlike nation in the history of the world when it comes to forcing other countries to adopt American principles. Since becoming a nation in 1776, the United States has enjoyed just 5 years free of military conflict or armed action somewhere in the world. Its global network of more than 800 military bases and installations spread over 80 countries is 3 times as many as all other countries combined. The US has become a victim of its own power, missing opportunities to cooperate rather than confront. The terminal decline and collapse of the Soviet Union is a prime example. From the late 1980s, Soviet decline offered the prospect of new partnership instead of perpetual rivalry. In the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev astonished US President Ronald Reagan at a summit in Reykjavik by indicating that the Soviet Union would like to end the Cold War and the arms race by negotiating a disarmament deal without preconditions. Both the USSR and the US were struggling to meet the enormous costs of the Cold War, and the advantages of a peace dividend to boost their economies were clear. 45 years of peace had also improved their relations considerably. But it seems that on both sides concern was growing that cutbacks in armed forces and arms manufacture, though they would bring a huge peace dividend, might also make the world a more dangerous place once again. Put simply, could the two sides trust each other and other nations not to cheat? And if they cheated, might superpowers then find themselves defenseless? The opportunity for the US to embrace Russia in a partnership for peace in Europe was swiftly squandered, politically and economically. The Americans refused loans to help the heavily indebted Russian economy, while assurances from President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker that NATO wouldn't seek to extend 1 inch to the east after German reunification were progressively reneged on. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, NATO has gained no fewer than 16 new members, with more to come. Bosnia, Georgia and Ukraine have all been recognized as aspiring and credible applicants. As former Soviet satellites signed up, Russia felt increasingly encircled, threatened and betrayed. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and George Kennan, the architect of the anti-communist containment strategy during the Cold War, both predicted that expanding NATO into Eastern Europe would provoke a bad reaction from Russia. Kennan warned that expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. And last but not least, it might make it much more difficult, if not impossible, to secure the Russian Duma's ratification of the START II agreement and to achieve further reductions of nuclear weaponry. Putin himself likened the possibility of NATO bases in eastern Ukraine to holding a knife to the throat of Russia. Jack Matlock, the US ambassador to Moscow from 1987 to 91, repeatedly criticized his own government's policy. He wrote, "I think to be fair to Putin, I would say he started out hoping to be, an ally of the United States. He was the first to call President Bush after 9/11. He offered full cooperation in our invasion of Afghanistan, including overflights, intelligence, and so on. What did we do in exchange? We withdrew from some of our most basic agreements with Russia. We kept expanding NATO, something that the first President Bush had promised Gorbachev we would not do if he allowed the unification of Germany and Germany to stay in NATO. Step by step, we pulled out of even our most basic agreements. And then, increasingly, we're surrounding Russia right up to their borders, right up to beyond their borders of the former Soviet Union, with a military alliance which they're not in." Now, no leader of Russia, no leader of any other country could maintain a cooperative relationship and also a full democracy in their country under the conditions of that sort. Back in 1991, as the Soviet Union finally broke up, Russian President Boris Yeltsin actually sent a letter to NATO suggesting that Russia's long-term aim was to join the alliance, but the US clearly had other ideas. President H.W. Bush had already addressed the UN General Assembly to unveil his New World Order. He called it a vision of a new partnership of nations that transcends the Cold War, a partnership based on consultation, cooperation, and collective action, especially through international and regional organizations. A partnership united by principle and the rule of law, supported by an equitable sharing of both cost and commitment. A partnership whose goals are to increase democracy, increase prosperity, increase the peace, and reduce arms. This was a vision of pure motherhood and apple pie. What's not to like? Unfortunately, an awful lot. Bush's New World Order was much less benign than it sounded. It was effectively a charter to further enable the strong to manipulate and exploit the weak. It undermined the principle that international affairs should be governed according to carefully negotiated international treaties, enforced where necessary by international courts. The clear framework of law requiring strict compliance from all parties gave way to a far more pliable network of informal arrangements. Henceforth, powerful Western nations could decide how the world should work on the basis of rules agreed between themselves, rules that suited their purposes. Instead of being properly discussed and debated, these new rules were just quietly adopted and implemented. They could be amended and updated by a simple exchange of emails. International law was to become increasingly marginalized and largely irrelevant. This became glaringly apparent when the UN Secretary-General Boutros Ghali advised the Security Council that the UN had no power to establish an international criminal court. He pointed out this could only be done by a unanimous vote by the General Assembly of the UN or by an international treaty. Madeleine Albright put Boutros Ghali under immense pressure to reverse his view by threatening to delay America's regular payments to the UN, which were already some $3 billion in arrears. Albright then used the US veto to prevent him being reappointed for a second term, the only Secretary-General to suffer this fate. It was a sea change in the way things were done, and it opened the way for many future departures from international law. By the time of the Kosovo War in 1999, it had become routine for the US and its allies to introduce major changes to rules and procedures by agreeing them privately among themselves. The UN wasn't even consulted about NATO's 78-day bombing of Serbia. Actions taken by the great powers no longer require a solid factual case to support them. Interventions can be made on the basis of media reports or political assertion that they would prevent a humanitarian tragedy of one kind or another. Crimes, it seems, no longer need careful definition and documentation before they become evidence. They can be simply labelled hate crimes or atrocity crimes, which journalists, politicians and the public find much easier to understand. American policy on intervening in Bosnia was fraught with internal division. It took several years to finally emerge. Warren Zimmerman, the US ambassador to Belgrade, later reflected, "The refusal of the Bush administration to commit American power early was our greatest mistake of the entire Yugoslav crisis. It made an unjust outcome inevitable and wasted the opportunity to save over 100,000 lives." At the outset, Clinton was firmly against committing US ground troops. In 1991, Secretary of State James Baker declared, "We don't have a dog in that fight." But by 1995, Bill Clinton's national security advisor, Anthony Lake, was bitterly condemning the failure to settle the Bosnia conflict as the cancer eating away at US foreign policy. With the presidential election looming, the superpower was worried it was losing international credibility and its long-held influence in Europe to the growing power of the European community. NATO, approaching its 50th anniversary, was in search of a new role after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the time seemed ripe to use the threat of force to aid the Bosnian peace process. And this is the point at which US involvement proved itself to be utterly duplicitous, hypocritical, and morally beyond the pale. Since the early 1990s, Washington had been covertly supplying arms to the Muslims in Bosnia in contravention of the European Community's arms embargo on all parties. A Dutch government intelligence report revealed that this vast secret conduit of arms smuggling through Croatia was arranged by clandestine agencies of the US, Turkey and Iran, with a range of radical Islamic groups including Afghan Mujahideen and pro-Iranian Hezbollah, anxious to help Muslims fighting in Bosnia. Writing in The Guardian, international security expert Professor Richard Aldrich traced the origin of the drive to arm the Muslims. In both Afghanistan and the Gulf, he wrote, the Pentagon had incurred debts to Islamist groups and their Middle Eastern sponsors. By 1993, these groups, many supported by Iran and Saudi Arabia, called in their debts with the Americans. Bill Clinton and the Pentagon were keen to be seen as creditworthy and repaid in the form of an Iran-Contra-style operation, in flagrant violation of the UN Security Council arms embargo against all combatants in the former Yugoslavia. Aldrich goes on, arms purchased by Iran and Turkey with the financial backing of Saudi Arabia made their way by night from the Middle East. Initially, aircraft from Iran Air were used, but as the volume increased, they were joined by a mysterious fleet of black C-130 Hercules aircraft. The US was very closely involved in the airlift. Clinton had secretly authorized the deal with Iran to supply weapons, while the US provided intelligence and training. The policy known as lift and strike was to lift the arms embargo on the Muslims and threaten the Serbs with airstrikes. In deciding that only the threat of force would concentrate Serb minds on a diplomatic solution, the US had clearly taken sides while purporting to play the honest broker. It consistently portrayed the Serbs as the aggressors in the war and intransigent and unreasonable when it came to negotiating peace. The Serbs themselves were never considered or ever reported as victims of genocide or ethnic cleansing, although they plainly were. Shortly after the fall of Srebrenica, Croatia, backed by NATO, brutally expelled some 300,000 Serbs from Krajina, where they'd lived for centuries, a massive and blatant war crime scarcely mentioned by the Western media. With breathtaking effrontery, Jamie Rubin, senior advisor to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, went on television to explain that portraying the Serbs as the bad guys in the Bosnian conflict was deliberate policy to create what he called moral clarity. For brass neck, this was as brazen as it gets. In the most egregious display of diplomatic bad faith imaginable, the Americans themselves had engineered the last-minute collapse in the EU peace deal for Bosnia by getting the Muslim leader, Izetbegovic, to pull out of a deal he'd previously agreed with all the other parties. The US ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, and Peter Galbraith, ambassador to Croatia, drove through the night from Zagreb to Sarajevo to persuade Izetbegovic to withdraw his signature. They told him he could get a better deal by delaying, which turned out not to be true. Every move was designed to unsettle and pressure the Serbs. They would effectively become scapegoats for the conspicuous failure of 20,000 UN troops to play an effective role in either protecting or ensuring the demilitarization of the so-called safe areas. In August 1995, during the temporary absence of UN Secretary-General Boutros Ghali, his deputy, Kofi Annan, gave Americans what Richard Holbrooke has called a big break. Annan instructed UN civilian officials and military commanders to relinquish for a limited period their authority to veto airstrikes over Bosnia. For the first time in the war, the decision on the airstrikes was solely in the hands of NATO, primarily two American officers, NATO's Supreme Commander, General George Julwan, and Admiral Leighton Smith, the commander of all US naval forces in Europe. Instead of calling a NATO Council meeting, Secretary-General Willy Kleis then simply informed the commanders it was their decision to bomb whenever they thought it appropriate. The direction of travel was always plain, and NATO did its master's bidding. The disastrous war of aggression was followed by the monumental failure to administer justice, fairly adjudicate war crimes, or lay the basis for future peace and reconciliation. UN Resolution 2131 declares a forceful intervention in any country to be aggression and a crime without justification, but NATO was never called to account. The most fateful product of the rules-based order was without doubt the illegal creation of the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY. The UN had no authority whatsoever to create a criminal court of any kind. Such a power had in fact been deliberately excluded from its charter. Well aware of this, the UN Secretary-General, Boutros Ghali, had at first balked at the idea of setting up an international court, saying this process would normally require an international treaty agreed by all UN members. But this was going to take time to negotiate, and time was of the essence. The Secretary-General's reluctance was quickly brushed aside by the apparent scale and urgency of the humanitarian crisis reportedly taking place in Bosnia. Hence his resort to Chapter 7 of the Charter. This states, quote, The Security Council shall determine the existence of any threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or active aggression, and shall make recommendations or decide what measures shall be taken in accordance with Articles 41 and 42 to maintain or restore international peace and security. But there was no threat to international peace and security. The unrest in the Balkans was clearly a civil war within Yugoslavia. Despite this and the fact that Chapter 7 had only ever been used previously to facilitate the delivery of urgent aid rather than create an international court, it was argued that it didn't specifically exclude that possibility. The tortuous justification was that while it may not be legal, it was legitimate. Having established the court illegally for entirely political purposes, the UN then refused to take responsibility for running it on the ground that it would be unethical to do so. It said the tribunal should operate independently. This would ensure impartiality and avoid any potential conflicts of interest which might arise if the UN were directly involved in prosecuting individuals from member states. The hypocrisy is transparent. The tribunal's statute was constantly being amended to ensure it remained a law unto itself. Prejudice and partiality were hardwired into the system to make sure that those who opposed the United States paid the price. The Americans promptly stepped in to staff, largely fund, and take full charge of running the ICTY, drafting the court statute to allow it to do anything it wanted. This set a dangerous precedent, clearing the way for many more tribunals and ad hoc courts to be created for Rwanda, East Timor, and other areas of conflict. As we've seen, the US crowned their success by contriving to get NATO, a strictly defensive alliance, to launch a massive bombing offensive against the Bosnian Serbs without UN backing. Suddenly, NATO had the new role it had been desperately seeking. The moral authority and leadership of the United States in international relations has long been deeply flawed, and no one was more aware of this than David Sheffer, the main architect of the ICTY and a critic of what he terms American exceptionalism. The United States, he wrote, has a tradition of leading other nations in global treaty-making endeavours to create a more law-abiding international community, only to seek exception to the new rules for the United States because of its constitutional heritage of defending individual rights, its military responsibilities worldwide, requiring freedom to act in times of war, its superior economy, requiring free trade one day and labour protection and environmental concessions the next day, or just stark native insularity. We sometimes want the rest of the world to right itself, but to leave the United States alone because of its exceptional character. Such exceptionalism ignores two of the basic building blocks of international law, the principles of reciprocity and the equality of nations. When nations create rights and duties among themselves, they must be bound by the same rules of the game, on the same playing field, regardless of their economic, political, or military might. The Council on Foreign Relations, an independent American think tank, has calculated that the United States enters into more than 200 treaties each year on a range of international issues, including peace, defense, human rights, and the environment. Despite this seemingly impressive figure, the United States, it writes, constantly fails to sign or ratify treaties the rest of the world supports. It's failed to ratify treaties that tackle biodiversity and greenhouse gas emissions, protect the rights of children and women, and govern international waters. For a country frequently looked to as a global leader, the United States has consistently failed to step up in international partnerships. In fact, the United States has one of the worst records of any country in ratifying human rights and environmental treaties. The United States still doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court. In 1998, it was one of only 7 countries to vote against the Rome Statute, alongside those bastions of freedom and democracy, China, Iraq, Israel, North Korea, Libya, Qatar, and Yemen. Although President Clinton signed up at the last moment in 2000, the treaty has never been submitted to the Senate for ratification. Presidents can sign treaties, but ratification requires the approval of 2/3 of the Senate. It's hard to claim moral authority when one fails to lead by example. Historically, the United States has never been a team player. The League of Nations, forerunner to the United Nations, was the brainchild of President Woodrow Wilson, but it failed, largely because the United States refused to be a member. Washington has consistently chosen aggressive competition over peaceful cooperation, when in reality its best interests would be served by making friends instead of enemies. The chronic reluctance of the US to play ball fatally undermines its international credibility and influence. It corrodes the trust and confidence essential for peaceful coexistence. George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in 2003 under a contested UN authorization, Washington's continued use of torture and failure to close Guantanamo Bay, Bush Jr.'s war on terror, which legitimized preemptive military action, the continuing US support for NATO's eastward expansion, all these policies have wrought havoc. Collectively, they amount to a comprehensive repudiation of everything the UN is supposed to represent. As a consequence, America's claim to be the principal defender of a rules-based international order rings somewhat hollow and casts serious doubt on the legitimacy and effectiveness of the current system. The US example has encouraged other countries to take a might-is-right approach to their own policy priorities, to misbehave and only obey the rule of law when it suits them. China, for example, has gone against the UN in claiming ownership of islands in the South China Sea, while Russia has broken the rules by seizing Crimea and the Ukraine. Henry Kissinger portrayed American foreign policy as a constant struggle between realism and idealism. The American experience, he wrote, encouraged the belief that America alone among the nations of the world is impervious and that it can prevail by the example of its virtues and its good works. In the post-Cold War world, such an attitude would turn innocence into indulgence. There's always been a tension between American self-interest and its commitment to human rights, as Richard Holbrooke, chief negotiator of the Bosnian peace talks, explains. Advocates of realpolitik have long argued that American advocacy of human rights conflicted with America's true national security interests, amounted to interference in the internal affairs of other nations, and weakened the nation's strategic and commercial interests. The unexpectedly successful creation of the ICTY turbocharged the US drive to dominance. Holbrooke quickly saw what a useful tool it would be in achieving American interests. Once the hunger for power can be fed, it always grows as appetite comes with the eating. By lending legitimacy and authority to reckless, illegal behavior, the tribunal made such future conduct increasingly likely. The Bosnia intervention was a serious misjudgment and set an appalling precedent. Despite the presence of 60,000 troops, a third of them American, the restoration of peace was glacial. I-4, the implementation force, and its successor, S4, the stabilization force, although given specific authority by Dayton to help maintain law and order, prevent arson and arrest wanted war criminals, always maintained that they had no obligation to do so. The military were totally risk-averse, terrified of mission creep and desperate to avoid troop losses. During the 25 years after the end of the Cold War, the US led regime-changing interventions in Kosovo 1999, Iraq 2003, and Libya 2011. All were justified by reference to humanitarian responsibility to protect goals, yet all broke international rules outlawing the use of force except in direct self-defense or with explicit UN Security Council authority. The first principle of intervention should surely be do no harm. None of these three regime changes has proved successful in creating stable democracies. Such interventions have invariably failed and served only to create further instability and fuel future conflict. Change can only endure if it has the consent of those concerned. The West's recognition of Slovenia, Croatia and Bosnia after their unilateral declarations of independence from Yugoslavia violated that principle, as did the case of Kosovo. For every Serb, Kosovo is the heart of Serbia. It was President Slobodan Milosevic himself who argued the case most compellingly in an interview with the American press. He explained that geographically the region is called Kosovo and Metohija. That's a Greek word meaning church property. Half of Kosovo belonged to the Serb Orthodox Church, with 1,800 listed churches of international heritage. "We come from there," Milosevic told the press. "How can anyone say, let's take this part of Serbia and give it to the Albanians to play with it? It's out of the question. Kosovo was never a part of Albania. We didn't commit invasion on the northern part of Albania. Albanians who went there over the mountains may freely stay there. That's all right, but they can't take a part of territory with them." Take, for example, the situation in Texas. You have a huge Mexican population there. What would happen if they were to say that they wanted to take a part of Texas and unite it with Mexico because they're a majority there? Would you allow that? It's not the question of human rights and question of democracy. This is a question of separatism, separatist movement. This is an entirely different thing. It has nothing to do with democracy, with human rights. It has to do with separatism and separatist movement, which uses terrorism as a means to an end. That is why we had to respond to terrorism and stop it, nothing else. The laxity of the rules-based system has always allowed the powerful to do as they will and the weak to suffer as they must. Such inherent injustice is the root of all violence and conflict. A relentless search for historical truth and a fair accounting is the only sure way to eradicate this, to restore justice and hope, and halt the slide to chaos.